Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you. Welcome to this talk sponsored by the Institute of World Politics. IWP is a graduate school of national security, intelligence, and international affairs. We offer a doctoral program, 7 master's degree programs, including 2 that are online, and 18 certificates of graduate study. If you are at all interested in learning more about us, please feel welcome to grab a staff member after the lecture. Again, to support the work of IWP, please visit iwp.edu/donate. Today we'll be hearing from Mr. Donald Bishop, who will deliver a lecture entitled Norman Rockwell's 4 Freedoms at 80. An Air Force Vietnam veteran who also served in Korea and on the Air Force Academy faculty teaching history, Mr. Bishop joined the U.S. Information Agency as a Foreign Service officer in 1979. During a 31-year career in USIA and state, he served in Hong Kong, Korea, Taiwan, on Capitol Hill, Bangladesh, Nigeria, and twice in China. At the Pentagon, he was the foreign policy advisor to the Commandant of the Marine Corps and then the USAF Chief of Staff before a final year at the American Embassy in Kabul. He is now a Krulak Center Distinguished Fellow at Marine Corps University in Quantico. With that, please welcome Mr. Donald Bishop.
And thank you.
Okay, today's talk is about the 4 freedoms proclaimed by President Roosevelt in 1941 without great success until the artist Norman Rockwell provided 4 paintings, 4 images that captured the American imagination. We'll look at the campaign's antecedents, the 1941 State of the Union Address and its initial lukewarm reception, Norman Rockwell's 4 freedoms, and their impact during the war, their post-war legacy, and some current criticisms. I will start out with a family story. President Roosevelt's 4 freedoms and Norman Rockwell's paintings have some antecedents that began in 1937. I learned this partly from my father. This is the Boy Scouts of Elmira, New York, at the train station, leaving for the first Boy Scout Jamboree in 1937, held right here in Washington. My father included. You squint, and he's hiding behind the last row. Now, 1937 happened to be the 150th anniversary of the U.S. Constitution. It's sesquicentennial. Now, each scout, including my father, received a copy of this book, prepared by Congress to mark the anniversary. Now note the painting by Howard Chandler Christie of Liberty Inspiring the Framers. And the sesquicentennial's planners decided to make 4 freedoms the branding concept for the sesquicentennial. Now here's Howard Chandler Christie's Liberty Inspiring President Roosevelt. Note that the painting lists the 4 freedoms of the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights. So Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or the press or the right of the people to assemble peaceably. So the 4 freedoms branding, the 4 freedoms of the First Amendment had a run. For example, at the 1939 World's Fair in Flushing Meadows, New York, the corners of the central square had 4 large statues representing the 4 freedoms. And they were sculpted by Leo Friedlander. And if you want to see more of his work, look at the large horse sculptures at the end of the Arlington Memorial Bridge. And in 1940, construction of a new building for the War Department began. Above the entrance was a substantial 4 Freedoms mural. The War Department soon moved to the Pentagon, but the building and the mural are still there. It's the State Department's Truman Building. The mural was hidden for many years, but it has now been restored. Now, in the design of the mural, martial scenes flank and clouds of aircraft protect the four freedoms, represented in a series of central motifs. So here's one of the martial views. And here's just one of the central scenes. That's one of the four freedoms in the Bill of Rights. So freedom of the press. Now, in January 1941, President Roosevelt gave his State of the Union address on January the 6th. The whole speech deserves rereading 82 years later, and the president's main focus was to urge Congress to pass Lend-Lease. As he said in the speech, to provide funds sufficient to manufacture additional munitions and war supplies of many kinds to be turned over to those nations which are now in actual war with aggressor nations. And I'd say this kind of echoes our current discussions of arms for Ukraine. But as the speech concluded, the president shared a vision of a world founded on four essential human freedoms. Now, he used the familiar four freedoms label, but he reformulated the four. So, next. Okay, I promise to keep wordy slides to a minimum. But, okay, from the speech, the first is freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world. The second is freedom of every person to worship God in his own way, everywhere in the world. The third is freedom from want, economic understandings which will secure to every nation a healthy peacetime life for its inhabitants, everywhere in the world. And the fourth is freedom from fear. Now, what she said meant a worldwide reduction of armaments, that no nation will be in a position to commit an act of physical aggression against any neighbor anywhere in the world. Now, the new four freedoms began to circulate. This poster, published by the Pennsylvania Library Association, lists FDR's new list of four freedoms. And when President Roosevelt met Prime Minister Churchill in 1941, the Atlantic Charter that they signed stated certain common principles as the United Kingdom and the United States faced Nazi tyranny. A year later, FDR sort of extended the idea of freedom from want and fear that was mentioned in the Atlantic Charter with freedom of religion also. Now, domestically, the government, the Post Office Department in this case, tried to popularize the four freedoms, the new four freedoms, with the issuance of a postage stamp. They printed 1.3 billion copies of this stamp. And when war came in December 1941, different artists began to portray their own visions of the four freedom. Now, here's one artist's vision, just one. Perhaps you might type Arthur Zisk in your search engine and take a look at some of his very vigorous paintings from the wartime period and post-war too. And FDR himself commissioned a four freedom sculpture by Walter Russell, which went on display in Madison Square Garden with thousands of people coming to view it. It's now located in the city of Madison, Florida, city of the four freedoms. And Hollywood, in the person of Bing Crosby, stepped up to the plate. Now, here are 2 minutes of the 1942 film Holiday Inn. Note how this one clip incorporates Howard Chandler Christie's liberty and the four freedoms of the Constitution and the four freedoms in FDR's State of the Union address. And let's give this a try.
Was that MacArthur?
Say again?
Was that MacArthur?
Yes. Oh, sure. This could be deconstructed. It's very interesting. But I don't know about you, but I like Bing Crosby and his singing, but I'm not sure I'm inspired by that particular clip in the movie. And would I be inspired to rush out and enlist? Would I be inspired to buy a war bond? I'm not sure. And that was the problem that confronted the Roosevelt administration a year into the war. Pollster George Gallup reported that the Four Freedoms had not registered a very deep imprint here at home. And the Office of War Information feared that the campaign was a complete flop. But now, okay, as soon as all right, the next slide, please. Okay, good. I mean, we're all inspired by Bing Crosby.
And how propaganda has changed over the...
Well, sure. Any questions so far?
Have you been to the museum?
In Stockbridge?
Yeah.
Yes, I have. So that's the Norman Rockwell Museum in
Oh, yeah.
Stockbridge,
I've been there
Massachusetts. Yeah, it's very impressive.
Oh, it's amazing.
And they have the Four Freedoms paintings, in a special gallery. And, but of course the museum has expanded its writ, I guess, to make it a museum of American illustration. And so it has a continuous rotating series of exhibits on famous illustrators. So it's, there's more than just Norman Rockwell's Four Freedoms there. Okay, here we are. So, a flop. The Four Freedoms, not much imprinted in the American mind. And at this time, late 1942, enter the Vermont illustrator and artist, Norman Rockwell. In 1942, he became possessed by the need to take the Four Freedoms out of the noble language and put them in terms everybody can understand. And so he conceived 4 images, 4 paintings, and you can see him here as he's painting the first of the 4 paintings, Freedom of Speech, which we'll take a look at shortly. Rockwell expected that some government agency would like to take his images and use them for raising morale, raising inspiration, but he got a complete 0 response from government agencies. So instead, he turned to the Curtis Publishing Company. Now, the Curtis, and go ahead next. So the Curtis Publishing Company published a large format weekly magazine on every Saturday, the Saturday Evening Post. And they ran the 4 paintings, Rockwell's 4 paintings, in 4 consecutive issues, beginning on February the 20th, 1943, February 27th, March 6th, and March 13th. In other words, yesterday was the 80th anniversary of the first publication 80 years ago. Now let's spend a little bit of time looking at the 4 paintings. Okay, so the first is Freedom of Speech. Now from the blue pamphlet in the hands of the fellow in the foreground, you can tell it's a Vermont town meeting. And notice that our speaker has got the same pamphlet tucked in his pocket. And you can see that the man speaking, he's blue collar, he's a working man, compared to his neighbors with the white shirts and the neckties. But what I notice is that everybody is listening to him respectfully. And indeed, this whole painting conveys civility. and democratic discourse. Next. Now, the second is freedom from fear. Now, the context is, so there's a couple, of course, tucking their kids into bed, but the context of it is in the headline of the newspaper held by the father, which says bombings and terror. Now, perhaps they were thinking of London or Chongqing in China. You can tell by the slant of the eave that this is an attic room. And you can tell by the fact that the bed extends a little beyond the stairway, that this is a small, cramped place where they fit the children into. And then there's the rag doll on the floor. So the husband is apparently white collar, but I'd say he was on the lower rungs at some office. Third is freedom to worship. Now, it's a gathering of Americans at prayer. Now, I'd say the figures in the center, a little to the upper right, they represent the large Protestant congregations. The woman with the rosary and the braid over her hair, I'd say is an immigrant and a Catholic, is a Catholic and perhaps an immigrant. And in the lower right, the man is wearing a sungak. This is a hat you might notice from paintings of photographs of Gandhi or Sukarno. It's a hat popular in India and in Indonesia. But we should also notice in the upper left, there is a Black American. And this is pretty significant. The Saturday Evening Post's policy was only to show African Americans in subordinate roles like Pullman porters or children or help in the household. And so this is a little different. And so it takes a step toward inclusion, and it shows another stream of American Christianity at prayer. And the fourth painting, freedom from want. Now, the interesting thing about this painting is, at the time of the Depression, just coming out of the Depression, when the memories of the Depression were fresh in Americans' mind, all the eyes went to the turkey. But now we live in a time of abundance, and perhaps we can even say over-nutrition. And so what do our eyes notice now? It's what many Americans lack. It's this family that's there. Our eyes go to the side. So this is an example of a painting that is still in dialogue with American people. And just to mention, the magazine published the paintings with an essay on the facing page, each one. The editors showcased the paintings, but they knew that the images needed words too. And we can count this as a homework assignment for all of you. Read the four Freedoms essays that appeared in the magazine opposite the paintings. They're all on the Curtis Publishing Company Saturday Evening Post website in one place. They're definitely worth reading. The essays were written by three giants of American letters in the 1930s and 40s. So Booth Tarkington, the Indiana writer. Perhaps you remember the Orson Welles movie, The Magnificent Ambersons. That was based on a Booth Tarkington novel. And Alice Adams, starring Katharine Hepburn, that's another Tarkington novel. And so it's Stephen Vincent Benet, the great storyteller of the age, Will Durant. Perhaps on these shelves someplace, there's the 10 volumes of World History and Philosophy by Will Durant. He was one of the writers as well. The fourth was an immigrant from the Philippines, Carlos Bulasan. And if you read his essay, you'll see that it has quite a different tone than the others. Now, the paintings were an immediate sensation. The magazine sold 25,000 sets. Norman Rockwell received 60,000 letters of appreciation and suggestions, and they went on display around the country in a war bond show. Now, at all the locations, the Norman Rockwell Four Freedoms War Bond Show raised $133 million. Now, I ran the inflation calculator, and that would be $2.2 billion in today's money. Pretty substantial effect. Now, here's Rockwell autographing one of those printed copies. And if you happen to find these old prints in the attic, check out eBay first before you give them away. So, this set, on sale for $2,700. So let's say they've appreciated and are appreciated. So the paintings popularized the Four Freedoms concept beyond anything the administration could hope for. They flowered in a Four Freedoms flag that was used at public ceremonies. Formally, it's called the Four Freedoms United Nations Honor Flag. And when the United Nations was established in 1945, some urged that this flag become the flag of the United Nations. And look at this poignant photograph. Okay, this is photograph taken just across town at Thaddeus Stevens School. Now, these students are at a segregated school. They know that they don't fully possess the same four freedoms that other Americans do, but they raise the flag to honor its ideals. So this is 1943. I'd like to think that some of those students still lived in Washington in 1963 and went down to the mall and heard Dr. King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Now we can fast forward to some other representations of the Four Freedoms as the war went on. So the many artists took their brushes and their pens in hand. Here's just one of dozens of representations. The cornucopia, for instance, representing freedom from want. Here's the mural painted in 1943 in the Burbank, California City Council chambers. The quilters got into action. And you can find on the web many examples of Four Freedoms quilts. Next, Robert Russell Bennett composed a Four Freedoms symphony. And let's take a look at this. This is from a comic book, Freedom from Fear. That's the topic. Okay, let's look from the upper left. No secret police will ever break into our home. Okay. I'll never be put in a concentration camp. Okay. No Hitler Youth gang will snatch our children from us. Okay. Look what the daughter says. When I grow up, I can choose career or marriage, whichever I wish. Well, I don't think that occurred, to all the Four Freedoms, as great principles, but it's quite an interesting, how the Four Freedoms would stimulate this kind of new thinking for the wartime. Next. The Office of War Information decided to use the Four Freedoms in its overseas campaigns, directed at neutrals, at allies, and enemies. And so look for this 8-page pamphlet on the web. And so you can understand how the Four Freedoms were pitched to international audiences. And the pamphlet was written by four great 1930s, 40s minds, men of letters. Today, however, today's homework is for you to read the 4 essays in the Saturday Evening Post. Tomorrow's homework is to find this 8 pages and read. It's a really vigorous defense of the four freedoms. The Office of War Information began to internationalize the four freedoms in other ways. So here are the posters used in Spanish-speaking countries. And we can see by 1945, the four freedoms had become shorthand for the war aims of the Allies. And so in 1945, the Victory Medal was issued to 16 million Americans who had served in uniform during the war. And what was the war about? According to the medal, freedom from fear and want, freedom of speech and religion. So that sums up the effect of the four freedoms as expressing the war aims of the United States. And that's the end of the war. But the power of the four freedoms extends beyond into after the war. Now, you have to squint and read Polish. But here are four freedoms overprints on the postage stamps used by the Polish army in Italy. You know, these are the troops that fought at Monte Cassino and are not going to go back to communist Poland. But so they waited, they used these stamps as they waited resettlement in England. Next, okay. Now this photo of Eleanor Roosevelt captures the culmination of the four freedoms sort of momentum after the war. The preamble to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights reads, disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind, and the advent of a world in which human beings shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief, and freedom from fear and want has been proclaimed as the highest aspiration of the common people. Now, if I can digress a little, when I was assigned to China and would speak with intellectuals there, professors, and so on, I often pointed out to them, introduced really to them, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I could tell by their nonverbals that they hadn't thought that things like freedom of speech was a universal human right. So the Declaration still has some power. So the four freedoms continued to inspire artists. Here's Arthur Sisk again in 1949. Next. Here are four paintings in the Mississippi Museum of Art in 1959. And did you know that Evansville, Indiana is the city of the four freedoms? Here are four renderings of the four freedoms in the Cox corridors of the U.S. Capitol. And the East Tennessee War Memorial. You can tell the center pillar has got the four freedoms around it. Here's a rather new Four Freedoms Memorial in upstate New York in the town of Minerva. There's a park in Florida and a trail in North Florida. Okay, the four freedoms are on the wall of the FDR Memorial here in DC. You can probably walk from the Leo Friedlander horse statues over to the FDR Memorial. Yes, and perhaps the greatest of the post-war tributes to the Four Freedoms is the magnificent FDR Four Freedoms Park, just off Manhattan on an island. It's interesting, it opened in 2005, but the design for this park was the last project undertaken by Louis Kahn, the great American architect, before he died. And we can continue. Four Freedoms film festivals. And Four Freedoms art exhibits, they still go on. Four Freedoms student art contests. And there are many warm portrayals of the Four Freedoms. The evidence that Four Freedoms have become iconic American images can be seen in these many imitations. Oh, Charlie Brown, with the turkey. Doesn't that warm the heart? And if Charlie doesn't do it, it's next. It's Mickey and Minnie. Okay, the Four Freedoms right there. Freedom from want. Next. Oh, Superman and Wonder Woman. Oh, Barbie. Serving her friends at Thanksgiving. Oh, you like the next one? I'm actually kind of charmed by this. The Obamas at Thanksgiving dinner. Now, sometimes the iconic power of the images is used for social commentary. For instance, here I'd say an artist, The Simpsons, have used the Four Freedoms, Freedom from Want template, but there's a little comment about, let's say, the lack of table manners that characterizes younger generations. And here's a comment here's a comment on fast food in American society. So it replaces both healthy nutrition and Thanksgiving traditions. Okay, now, the Four Freedoms paintings have also provided a template for criticisms. Some now say that Rockwell's paintings show a monochromatic yesteryear America that doesn't look like the America of today. And so people have been experimenting with substitutions. So you can see this on the right is an effort to show that American society has changed, that it has more variety. How about this next one? This is a takeoff on freedom from fear. I like the Marine, the absent Marine father who's off fighting someplace, but mom is taking care of the kids. Next. Okay, so substitutions. Instead of the working man, you have a working woman with a more diverse group of Americans listening respectfully, civilly to what she has to say. Now, some of these edge over into images that show frustration or even bitterness. So here's a more inclusive portrait of a black woman doing the speaking, but you can see others are kind of shouting her down. So that's revealing some of the less attractive side of American society. Next. And then there's the whole issue of hypocrisy, saying that, and Rockwell's portrayals only showcase ideals, but the reality is harsher. So now here's an old one by Herblock, the cartoonist, Whatever Happened to Freedom from Fear? And if you ain't for Franco and Chang, you're un-American. This uses the familiar template or the familiar label of Four Freedoms to criticize society. Now, here's one that really shocked me the first time I saw it. Now, it was commissioned for the New Yorker magazine, though they never did use it as a cover illustration. It shows a family of Muslim immigrants. And who knows what they fled to come to the United States. Now, all immigrants try to hold on to something of their old culture. And members of this family, Muslims, are holding on to a head covering and a headscarf, prayer cap and headscarf. But they've taken the first step to becoming Americans by having a turkey for their Thanksgiving dinner, and then the brick through the window. And for sure, this is not typical, but it hurts to know that some newcomers face this kind of reaction. So this is a takeoff on the four freedoms that makes you think some about our current issues. Okay, now this is a school of world politics, national security. And why have I come here to talk about the four freedoms? Now, many of you may know the writing of the late Colonel John Boyd of the Air Force, the fighter pilot who changed the art of war. And he said that Americans must have a grand ideal, an overarching theme, a noble philosophy that represents a coherent paradigm within which individuals as well as societies can shape and adapt to unfolding circumstances, yet offers a way to expose flaws of competing or adversary systems. I'd say the four freedoms are such a philosophy. Next. Former Marine Corps General and Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, knew the four freedoms as a grand ideal, an ideal that attracts people. I had many privileged glimpses into the human condition, but I never once saw human beings flee the freedom of speech. I never saw families on the run from the free practice of religion. As a young Marine, I never picked anybody out of a raft on the ocean, desperate to escape a free press. When I was in Hong Kong, there were still, it was a while ago, but there were still people swimming from the last island in mainland China to the nearest island in Hong Kong. There wasn't anybody swimming back to China. It shows the power of the principles that the four freedoms captured. Next. Okay, I hope you all watched the Tom Hanks movie, Greyhound. It's about the Battle of the Atlantic in World War II, the corvettes and the destroyers against the U-boats. The film Greyhound is based on a 1958 novel by C.S. Forrester, The Good Shepherd. And in the novel, the American Captain Krause, who's the head of the convoy escorts, he poses the question, why are we doing this? And the answer, he says, is 1,000 miles ahead of the convoy, men were waiting for the ships to arrive. If those ships did not reach their destination, the men and women and children who awaited their arrival would be hungry, cold, diseased. They might be torn apart by explosives. But then he continued. They might suffer a fate even worse, a fate they had years earlier decided would be worse. They might be subjected to a tyrant of alien thought, their liberties torn from them, and in that case, not only they, but the whole human race would suffer, and liberty would decline throughout the world. Okay, so I submit, years earlier, Americans decided that freedom would be the dominant organizing principle of our society. Franklin Roosevelt and Norman Rockwell just gave us concepts and images for four of the freedoms, four liberties. So it's not time for us to forget them. It's not time for us to discard them. Yes, reimagine them for the America of our century. Yes, make them be ideals at home as well as abroad. But I say, embrace them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop. We have about 10 minutes for a Q&A, so if you guys have questions, I'll bring the mic around.
Yes.
First of all, I want to apologize for asking you if you've been to the museum. That's the most ridiculous question I could have asked.
No. Actually, it's.
No, I'm very sorry, but
it's
I've
out
been
in
there
the
several times.
countryside in Massachusetts. You got to go a long way to get there. But
And I
yes.
believe and endorse everything you said about the Four Freedoms and about Norman Rockwell.
Yes.
I don't think too many people know that he was the cover artist for the Saturday Evening Post from 1916 to 1976. He did 335 covers for the most popular magazine in the history of the world, or certainly the country. And it's my felt need that this institute, IWP, requires at least one Norman Rockwell portrait up there on the wall to inspire everybody, because
Well, I'd say management is listening.
management is apparently here, and I
What a
rest.
wholesome thought.
I think, sir, you have made the case. Thank you very much.
Do go to the Norman Rockwell Museum. It's way out in the west of Massachusetts, so it's sort of off the beaten path if you're taking the Acela, up to Boston. But there's just a lot. There's a lot to see there, and there was a Norman Rockwell Museum in Vermont, but it is closed. But the Norman Rockwell Museum in Stockbridge, that's got money and horsepower behind it, so it's good. And I actually saw the Four Freedoms paintings here at George Washington University when they from time to time they send them around so people can see. And we all see the Four Freedoms paintings from slick magazine prints. When you see the paintings, you notice different things because they've got texture, and like the hands on the freedom of speech fella. They're very powerful in person that you don't quite catch from the prints.
I have to leave, but just as an afterthought, his paintings were very instrumental in the civil rights revolution of the mid-1960s. That's for sure.
Yes, I could have spent a few minutes on that. Yes, in the late 50s and 60s, he turned his painting to civil rights, and just type Norman Rockwell civil rights paintings in your search engine, and you'll see some of them. And I'd say they made people think. Yes.
So why do you suppose FDR reformulated the four freedoms from the First Amendment to?
Yeah. Well, so actually he said freedom of speech and expression. So it was one of the new formula, and I think that includes freedom of the press, and you can assemble to make the. So he kind of used this. He used freedom of speech and expression to kind of wrap together, make more compact several of those First Amendment freedoms, because he wanted to make room for freedom from fear and freedom from want. And so I think that, and he was the war was on. So I think he wanted to highlight the challenges of the war at the time. That's my guess.
What subject do you teach in Quantico?
Generally, my real area is propaganda and disinformation, and disinformation and all the related topics. That owes to my having been in the U.S. Information Agency in the glory days. We're always reading, what stories the Soviets planted in local newspapers, and anyway, that's. But like many all Foreign Service officers, we can talk about anything for 3 minutes. Ask me about intellectual property. Ask me about weapons of mass destruction. I got 3 minutes on all those topics. But as far as going deeper, I've been attracted to the Four Freedoms for some years, since I was young.
We have time for about one more question, at least in the formal portion. Do I see any more? Excuse me.
Thank you. Don, I was wondering, in light of the divisions in our country
Yes.
today, do you imagine that these themes still have a unifying potential, especially since there are a lot of people who don't care about freedom of worship because they don't worship. There's opposition to freedom of speech on our campuses and in the cancel culture. And people take for granted the prosperity that we have. They think it just happens as opposed to being the result of very discrete policies.
Yes.
Anyway, I'd be grateful for your reflections about this.
Oh, boy. I'll be happy to speak at a one-day conference just to answer that question. I'm going to pause just on one point. Norman Rockwell, when he got those 60,000 letters, different themes emerged, and many business people said, well, yeah, we like those 4 freedoms, but you missed freedom of enterprise. And freedom of enterprise, that's pretty important to creating the prosperity that we know. And the president of Exxon, or the chairman of Exxon, I guess, was testifying before Congress. He said, yeah, we got freedoms and freedom of enterprise. And I said, oh, you should be talking to Norman Rockwell. Okay, now, as a public diplomacy officer, if I put my hat back, I retired 12 years ago, but if I put on that perspective for a moment, and I think about America's way in the world and the power we have that's not military power or economic power, but is sort of moral power or persuasive power, one of the greatest challenges is now that America is so divided. And there are signs that it's getting worse, may get worse before it gets better. So I guess my thought is, when you encounter a bad idea, the only solution is response is a good idea. And so, for instance, the essay on freedom to worship by Will Durant, who by that time in his life is not a believer, is very powerful in expressing what religion does for society. So I guess, I think that if there were more focus, I hope that if there were more focus on the 4 freedoms, and talk about it in schools, talk about it on the talk shows, and if you can get people to calm down from public disputes, to just talk them through, that's the only way to re-heal things. Freedom of speech applies equally to the left or to the right. And if people are discouraged as opposed to hopeful, well, it has to be talked through. So I don't see any immediate solution, but I think one of the benefits of the 4 freedoms paintings and the 4 freedoms discussion would be to get people to think hard about what they have. Now, if you look at those, sorry, I'm going to go on. If you look at the paintings in Spanish, the posters in Spanish, they got bayonets, trashing, freedom of speech and so on. Sort of typical wartime propaganda, which does a lot of emphasis of negatives. They're coming for us. But the power of the Rockwell paintings is they're all positive. They made people feel good. They made people feel confident. This is what we have. We are who we are because we have these 4 freedoms. And the Nazis And the Japanese are coming after us and with quite different ideas. So I think that the success of the Four Freedoms was because they were a warm, positive expression of American values, as opposed to the usual propagandistic emphasis on threats. So how to create that warm feeling of what we have is good for the left, it's good for the right, it's good for, anyway, it's good. So that's my only, so there's no instant solution, no magic wand to wave. Yes? Vision. Ah, the vision. Well.
Right, there's a lot of talking, but I think that when you have a vision, and Rockwell had a vision, that people could see the vision.
Well, but another thing is that I think that study of the social media is increasingly revealing. I mean, this is like the algorithmic studies, and that, you know, I don't know, 80% of the posts are by 2% of the people. So you have the charged up, angry perhaps people who are just by their continuous flooding of comments or perhaps memes, you know, into the social media space is sort of overpowering your ordinary, you know, ordinary thoughts of ordinary people. And then for people who are not so experienced yet, like college students, high school students whose mind is on the phone, using all their spare time on the cell phone, then they're vulnerable to this, you know, to being misled. So anyway, that means parents have to talk to the kids, means teachers have to talk. So anyway, I suppose candidates have to talk too, but I just wish they'd talk kind of calmly.
Do you think it's because the amygdala, when you have the fear, the amygdala shuts down?
Okay, so,
Right?
well, I don't know enough psychology,
Okay.
but I'm increasingly persuaded that the communications people in, say, the Army's information operations or in the Foreign Service's public diplomacy, they need to study psychology, a lot of psychology. And it's kind of missing from the Army does a better job than the Foreign Service, but understanding the, you know, where human motivations come from, how people can be manipulated, the psychology of that bears a lot more studying. So you need to think of it not just as communications, but you have to think of it as mentalities or psychology. So, okay, well, I thank this ardent crowd. Okay.